Howdy folks, I want to welcome you to the campfire, a place where we can just sit and tell a story or two and we can ponder on the unusual and mysterious things that occur out here in the wild. I'll tell you some of my stories and well, you can tell me some of yours. This is Clay Steele. Come join me around the campfire here beneath the stars. Grab a cup of coffee or a cold drink and let's talk about our stories. Can't wait. Hey, there you are. Glad you could make it to the campfire this evening. Now, there's a few of us already here, but I'll bet we can find some room if everyone sort of scoots a little closer to one another and get you something to drink. There's hot cocoa and coffee, and somewhere there's a bottle making the rounds. So get settled in because there's a story that I'm just dying to tell you. Now, I heard this from a good friend just the other day, and I'm wanting to share. It occurred not too long ago and not too far away from here in a place called Coram's Ferry. It's a small town, about 2,500 souls on the banks of a good solid river. Now, this story is about a good, peaceful woman. She lived a long, happy life and most certainly died of old age. You know, that's when your spirit outlives your body. Now, she had many friends and was known as a kind and wise woman. She wasn't the talkative type. No, she wasn't. But she said what had to be said and got her point across with the fewest possible words. She'd been a school teacher for 45 years at the elementary school in town, and she was known as a sort of a miracle worker with slower students. Or she had a way about her. Like, she was able to draw them out of their shell, and many became really good students. They just sort of needed to be understood first. Then they wanted to please this woman she didn't use many words, but she communicated better than many people that spoke volumes. Always sporting a smile with sharp twinkling eyes. When she locked you in her gaze, understanding just seemed to flow between you. Well, she never married. It was told that she once loved a young man who never returned from the war in Europe. So, for whatever reason, she never fell in love again. She was what was referred to as a spinster. She had no husband, no children. So the love of her life became her garden and the grounds around her old house. She lived out of town about 3 miles. The property was lush with a nice yard and a nice year-round creek running through it. Now, because of the water, she was able to grow quite a variety of trees and bushes with one of the nicest vegetable gardens around. She always gave vegetables and fruit to friends in town and kind of seemed like she had more of a farm than a garden with the volume. Well, heck, the amount of fruit and produce she grew could probably feed about 100 people. She must spend all day, every day, working her grounds in the garden. Now, the creek was lined with thick band of trees and low brush. It ran from the low hills a few miles away through the farmland to her 10-acre forest, then passed through it to wind away towards the river near town. So she lived in sort of a paradise where all is provided for you if you just work for it. Well, and that was sort of the mystery. It was rare to get an invitation to the old woman's property, and those that did were struck by the beautiful yards and gardens. I mean, it's just, they wondered how she was able to do all this work by herself. She never hired any labor from town, and no one was ever seen coming or going. And it's the country, so if anyone were to be coming or going, everyone would know. There's no big secrets out there, or so they thought. See, the rumors were that she had slaves that she kept in the basement, slaves to perform all the hard labor around her estate, but there was just no evidence of that. These were just stories made up to try to explain the unexplained. There were stories that would circulate, told by wide-eyed teens, of sounds or sights from the home, when some locals would venture out on a Friday night usually, to park their car on the side of the road and sneaked forward for a ways till they came close to the house. Now, no one ever made it through the thick hedge next to the road, but the sounds of activity were what fueled the stories. Often there were sounds of work, like sawing of wood or moving of brush, as you would expect. Occasionally, some high schoolers would hear voices, but with no evidence, it was always just chalked up to their fantastic imagination of a teenager on a Friday night adventure, often fueled by beer or maybe even some Boone's Farm. Do you remember Boone's Farm? Oof. Or Strawberry Hill? Oh boy, it wasn't very good, but it sure was cheap. It fit into the budget of a teenager. Now, it seemed like that place had been there forever. And in fact, it had been for the people of Carm's Ferry. The old woman had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Well, alive anyway. 70, 80 years, all of her life. Well, in reality, she had inherited the house and property. It was a rundown wreck. She had a distant uncle that had died with no heirs. She inherited it as a child. At 18 years of age, she finally took possession of the estate, and she and the young man she loved began to clean the overgrown grounds and repair the house. Now, the house, being well built, it had survived the neglect, but it needed lots of attention. Well, then our country was attacked, and we went to war. The young man volunteered, as most eligible men did. Swearing his love for her and promising to return, he left to fight in Europe. Like many young soldiers, he didn't return. His young fiancée was heartbroken. She put all of her time into teaching the kids of Coram's Ferry and finishing the restoration of her house. Keeping mostly to herself when not in town, she just lived her life. Well, after retirement, she was rarely seen in town. 2 or 3 times a month, she would drive in for supplies, nails, tools, paint, and any food staples that she couldn't produce herself. So she saw her doctor twice a year, and in fact, it was said that it probably wasn't even necessary, as she was just extremely healthy. Seems like good food and lots of physical exercise is good for a body. Well, we all wear out at some point, and during the most recent doctor's visit, her physician warned her of a murmur in her heart, advising his longtime patient and friend of a weakening heart and suggesting maybe she should consider moving into town and selling her estate. Well, she had known him since he was a child. In fact, she taught him for 2 years in school, so there was a certain understanding between them. She looked him straight in the eyes with her knowing, kind gaze and said, "I will be ready when I go, and I will live my life until the end. Now, doctor, I must go home, for I have many things to do." And with that, she thanked him and walked out. The call came into the 911 call center, and there was no voice on the other end. This happens frequently enough so that the fire department and a sheriff's deputy in a cruiser, to help sort it out, got sent to the call. Now, because of the thick hedge and the lock on the iron gate, the fire department had to use their jaws of life to pry the gate open. They followed the low light coming from the house to the big double doors that opened from the house into the gardens. Well, there, in a large open room, laid out on a huge wooden bed and covered with flowers, was the woman. She was dead. The autopsy would show that her heart had quit. She was laid out wearing a beautiful dress. It was a wedding dress. And in her arms was the portrait of that young man from so many years ago. Well, she had no heirs, so the county got her property. And while cleaning out the grounds, they planned to turn it into a park. They noticed how well maintained the trees and the bushes were. They noticed the irrigation ditches throughout the grounds and the hollowing out of the tree line along the creek. It was thick and jungly on the outside and green and open on the inside next to the creek there. Well, they figured it'd be too much maintenance to keep in such good condition. The plan was just to let it go back to nature. Well, the real surprise was what they found in the garden. It could only be described as a classroom. Well, there were low benches with sturdy tables, and there was a lectern with a chalkboard behind it. It just looked like a classroom. Now, the walls and the roof were the vines and the trees of the garden. What had gone on here? Had classes been taught? It wasn't the people from town that sat here, and what are the massive gardens and huge shade trees? Who harvested all the fruit from the many trees? We won't know for sure. There's no one alive that knows. Now, since that time, the park gets so little use, only an occasional visit from a carload of teens on a Friday night. Usually on a dare, because that place is scary. Overgrown and dark with lots of bushes, some people claim to have seen large shapes moving through the shadows. What were they seeing? Are they what's left of the old woman's workforce? Did she have a community of beasts there? Now, with her strong teaching skills, was she able to communicate with them? Well, that we're never going to know. That's all lost to time. But there are many things there that you have to consider. So it is, folks, that if you really want to understand something, looking and listening are your best methods. Talking just sometimes confuses the issue. Well, it's late, folks. The fire's burning down. Seems like a good time to stop for the night. We'll do this again soon. So as always, this is Clay Steele. Be good to yourselves.